people in. So I am delighted. I'm Douglas MacLeod. I'm the chair of architecture at the RAIC Center for Architecture at Athabasca University, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here with yet another event in our global studio. And I wanted to share with people, many of us from around the world worked together to craft a proposal to get additional funding for the global studio. It was a very powerful proposal, and I'm hoping that on September 30th, we'll be notified that we got the funds. And if we do, then we're going to expand our activities. But frankly, even if we don't, we will continue in some way, shape, or form. The other thing I just wanted to share with you is, I was mentioning to others that Athabasca is now, well, we've been given approval within the university to begin planning and preparing our own online Masters of Architecture, which we hope one day will be accredited. But we've learned so much from the other institutions around the world, and I would hope that that sort of process could continue as we develop our online Masters, and we could share curriculum and other materials together. And the other thing I just wanted to say is that our next event, we hope that we'll be screening the movie called Solidarity on Wednesday, October the 28th. So that's a Wednesday rather than a Thursday, but at the same time, which is 9 a.m. Mountain Time. And Solidarity, the subtitle is Revealing the Everyday Lived Reality of COVID-19 in Kliptown, Soweto. And Kristen Kornienko, who's with us today, was the producer of the film. And it's both shot and driven by the people living the story, a group of squatter camps and academia. And it shows the urgency of what the pandemic is doing today in Kliptown, which is really what's been described as a neighborhood of shacks that has been neglected by the government for decades. So it's going to be a very interesting screening, and there'll be lots of time for Q&A. But on that note, though, I do want to hand it over to Sam Obo, who is going to introduce today's speaker. Sam is an old friend of our Center for Architecture. He's also a past president of the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada, and he's worked all over the world as an architect. So with that, Sam, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Oh, thank you, Doug. It's a pleasure. It's always a pleasure being associated with the good work that the Athabasca University is doing, and also seeing a lot of familiar faces. It's my honor to introduce Nmadili Okwumabua, who is going to be giving us the lecture, in a moment. And without much ado, just a brief comment about, Nmadili. I first met Nmadili some few years ago. It's quite a number of years now. And surprisingly, she attended one of my lectures in Abuja, and it was so familiar that we thought we've met, and it was really quite striking to see what her opinion is on African architecture, which we share in common. So Nmadili is a professor of African architecture and urban design, and the founder of the Community Planning and Design Initiative Africa, which many of you know as CPDI Africa. Her passion for design is rooted in a vision where communities in Africa and in the diaspora are developed with new architectural languages that are culturally and environmentally sustainable. Nmadili attended the University of Tennessee and Georgia State University, where she pursued her undergraduate studies in architecture and urban studies. She holds a master's degree in African studies from Clark Atlanta University, where her research centered on the evolution of central modern vernacular architecture in the works of Demas Oko. For those of you that knows, Demas Oko used to be one of what they call the Zaria rebels, that started the School of Arts and Architecture in Nigeria in the 50s. So Nmadili is a licensed realtor in the state of Georgia and a certified property manager with Brawl CBRE South Africa. In 1999, she founded Southern Sahara USA, a design consultancy service specializing in the research and development of this new architecture. In 2013, she launched CPDI Africa, the culture-inspired initiative that promotes these architectural languages through design competitions, lecture series, workshops, architecture exhibitions and international global studios for teaching African-centered architecture. Cultivating a built environment profession that has spanned over 25 years, Nmadili lives in Atlanta, Georgia and Abuja, Nigeria, where she continues to offer international consultancy services in urban design and real estate asset management. So ladies and gentlemen, presenting Nmadili Okwumabua.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Architect Sam Owo, for that wonderful introduction. Let me go ahead and share my screen so we can get started. 1 second. All right. Everybody out the way. Okay, so Sam, thank you once again. It's such a pleasure to be here. Professor Douglas MacLeod and the team from Athabasca University. This is appreciated in such a major way. This is such an incredible opportunity to present on the Global Studio platform today and share this story with our collective audience. I'm truly excited for this opportunity. Thank you. My name is Nmadili Okwumabua. I am the founder of CPDI Africa, which is stands for the Community Planning and Design Initiative Africa. And my lecture today is titled Africa Defines Architecture: The Quest for Defining New African-Inspired Design Languages that are culturally and environmentally sustainable. I would like to read a page from our website just to set the scene, right, for today's lecture. Have you ever imagined what the architecture of Africa would look like today if the great civilizations of Egypt, Timbuktu, Mali, the Dogon, Zulu, Yoruba, and thousands of other African empires had continued to develop and evolve in their own unique identity? Imagine the transformation of the African landscape into sprawling metropolises filled with architectural masterpieces, celebrating new interpretations of traditional design elements, portrayed with all the comfort of modern technology. Now imagine once again that you have been given the opportunity to create these new design languages, drawing inspiration from Africa's glorious past, reflecting elements of her present identity, and then creating new languages so dynamic and innovative that it develops the foundation for the continent's emerging future. You, the creator and custodian of Africa's newly imagined environment. You, the architect of Africa's future. With that, it sets the idea in motion that a possibility for Africa's current landscape could have been inspired by that. Looking at this image, you see an environment that truly is inspired by those languages that Africa had created. You see the pyramids, you see skyscrapers inspired by Dogon architecture, Zulu shields, you see the Sphinx, that triangle that is so holy and so sacred in African elements, aesthetics, and of course, architecture. Could this have been the image of Africa's built environment today, if indeed she had continued to develop in her own identity? The artist for this image, I am not sure who he is or she is, but I always like to give respect to this creative image. You can't talk about a projected idea for what Africa could look like without speaking about Wakanda. That's the most recent image, at least on the big screen. The entire world got to witness what some of us may imagine Africa would have looked like. You can see these images inspired by traditional design once again. They're skyscrapers, possibly of clay, of adobe. You do see thatched roofs on skyscrapers. That's an interesting image. You see the pyramids in the background. Again, these images pulled from traditional African architecture. Another one that I like to share is by game designer Jerris, who actually lives in Canada, originally from Congo. He created this image for the gaming industry. And so it comes to life with music and moving water. But it's so evocative of the Africa that we would imagine. The spirituality in the mass jumps out at you. The natural colors, the patterns, the motifs. This does portray an Africa that would have evolved had she continued to develop in her own image. But why is it so important to develop an Afrocentric theoretical framework for developing African communities? For that, we need to look at the definition of architecture itself. The art and science of constructing a building, architecture, or an extended version would be the reflection of the culture, lifestyle, aesthetics, local building materials, climate, geography, political and economic purchasing power of a people in a place. All of these elements of culture will be translated into their built environment. That is actually the meaning of architecture. So of course, you can imagine that there will be all types of languages on any continent, in any country. You move around and you will see that their culture reflected in their built environment. There will be lots of design languages. So you have to close your eyes and open your eyes and you're in a space that's filled with buildings that look like what we see on the top left. Okay, I might be in Japan, I might be somewhere in Asia. Or you open your eyes and you look around, you're surrounded by buildings that look like the gingerbread buildings of Holland. You must say, okay, maybe I'm in the land of the Dutch. Or the red brick American McMansions, a very familiar sight. I might be in America. Or India, a space where deities are often placed on the facades of buildings in reverence. I might be in India. Or the architecture of opulence, grandeur, of a very successful economy. And of course, pulling on their cultural traditions. Okay, I may be in Dubai. Anywheresville, Chinatown, you land in a space like this, and no one has to tell you, you are familiar with these aesthetics. And it's not just the aesthetics, it's also what goes on behind the walls. How are the spaces utilized? What's the hierarchy? So as we define architecture for Africa, where could we possibly start? Okay, so for Africa, there will be a plethora of design languages. I love to show these maps because they give you such a clear visual of what we're talking about, all right? So the map on the left is Africa today, the 54 countries that were created after the Berlin Conference. These are the 54 national identities that all of us relate to when we think about Africa. But the map on the right shows Africa in fact. The black lines show the nations and the people of Africa, thousands of them. The red lines that are superimposed show the nations that we know today. If you look at the area where Nigeria is, you see that very dense collection of black lines. That's because in Nigeria alone, there are over 250 ethnic groups. So when you're talking about an African language for Nigeria, you could be just totally overwhelmed. Okay, well, maybe not all of them are different. Some will be the same based on proximity, but you will create a plethora of design languages because you could go in a mile in any direction and the language will change, the fashion, the spirituality, the food, the architecture, the climate, geography, it'll all change. And so for Africa, for those of us that are courageous, we rise to the challenge of creating new design languages for the continent. What an exciting journey to embark upon. But it just doesn't end in Africa. During the transatlantic trade, Africans were moved around the world, thereby creating new identities. Africans were moved to the Americas, to Europe, to Asia, and they settled and they formed new cultures that were inspired by who they were as Africans. And so you will begin to see new design identities in their built environment. And definitely if they were to consciously attempt to create African-inspired languages, you would see those Africanisms and retentions. But all of this was not on my mind when I started architecture school many, many years ago. I loved architecture, had always loved drawing buildings. Like most of us as a child, you're drawing, okay, wonderful. Got into the School of Design, was just having a great time. I didn't realize that anything was missing. I thought what I was learning was right on point. It was just, it was a great experience. Loved architecture. Until in 1994, I went to a NOMA conference. NOMA stands for the National Organization of Minority Architects here in the US. And so I was a member of the student chapter. So we headed off to Washington, DC. Howard University hosted us. And I met Professor David Hughes. He had just written his book, Afrocentric Architecture, a Design Primer. He had traveled all around Africa, studying the architecture, photographing, and he pulled his publication together and he was presenting it at this conference. And oh my goodness, my mind was blown. Architecture from an African perspective, who does that? This can't be possible, really, oh my goodness, wow, mind blown, right? The images he was showing, the stories, when I listen to him talk today, is still totally amazing. I was just so inspired to be who I really was. And so I sat and I listened and I just thought, okay, when I get back to school, this is gonna be awesome. This is next level, we're changing levels. His theory said, a distinctive manifestation of form, imagery, and space in the modern built environment, which derives from the cultural, environmental, and historical origins of the continent of Africa. I was taking that with me and I was heading back to Atlanta. What did I do? I got back, my goodness. I think I'd been in America about 10 years at that time. I'd forgotten I was a Nigerian. I am Nigerian American. So my mom is from Tennessee, my dad's from Nigeria. But after coming to America, I was all American. So I got back to school and I was like, oh my God, I got to pull my research, my heritage. Oh, that's right, I'm Igbo. I started remembering so many things growing up in Nigeria. What I really remembered was the work of architect, master builder Dimas Wonko, who happens to be a relative. And experiencing his architecture in Nigeria, but not knowing growing up why it was different. Loved it, but I was like, oh my gosh, I have so much to pull on, to reference. And so I came up with this amazing design and I presented it. And during jury, my professor calmly let me know, Nmadili, I'm so sorry. I don't even know how he let me get this far. He probably was telling me the whole time, Nmadili, stop, and I wasn't listening. You can't put Black and Africa and architecture in the same sentence. Africans don't have architecture. What Africa has is mud huts with thatch roofs. If you want to give Africa the pyramids from 10,000 years ago, okay, fine, maybe, but Africa doesn't, Black architects copy other people's culture in architecture. African architects haven't contributed anything to the discourse on contemporary architecture. And I just want to let you know, I was floored. Young and proud and excited about my discovery. I just could not see how I was going to continue in architecture. After all, architecture is a creative art, and we know from the definition, it reflects people's culture and aesthetics and all of that into the built environment. So everybody should be able to have an architectural language and an architectural identity. So I didn't understand how I would go through a program and not be allowed to bring myself, my authentic self, to the classroom, to my projects, like all my other classmates could do. So that day I packed up my model and my drawings, and I left the School of Design, and moved on to finish my degree in urban studies, and eventually got a master's in African studies. I did that because I needed an environment where I could explore what my professor had said to me. Was he wrong or was he right, and why? And I needed an environment where I could say Africa 1,000 times in one sentence and nobody would take offense. Nobody would have a problem. I could spend all my time doing research on what happened to the architecture of Africa. Again, was he right or was he wrong? Why? And so my journey started. Like most people, and like architecture itself, when you start the conversation, you are going to start in Africa, right? So you're going to go through all its monumental architecture from antiquity. You're going to talk about Egypt. Oh my God, mind's still being blown about Egypt. You're going to talk about Ethiopia, the stone-hewn churches. You're going to talk about Great Zimbabwe. I started. Of course, you're going to talk about the nostalgic architecture of traditional Africa, right? So these are the images that typically come to mind when we talk about architecture in Africa. It's the clay, it's the adobe, it's the thatch, right? It's these very, very interesting structures that look simple and easy. They may be, but this is the work of thousands of years of evolution of technique, art, and architecture. Of course, the patterns and motifs from different parts of the continent. I could tell the different signature styles. I learned, I taught myself. I went to libraries where, and bookstores where when you go to the section for architecture and you look for Africa, what you typically, this was 25 years ago, what you would typically see, buildings and books with, you know, people in the villages, you know, half clothed, and of course, all this traditional architecture, nothing contemporary, right? But no problem. I still had a wonderful time teaching myself. Of course, I had to understand colonial architecture in Africa. After all, this is mostly what we see in the urban environment. I'll tell a story here. Part of my research, this is in 2005, I believe, the African Union of Architects was hosting its members in Nigeria, in Abuja. And I was living in the States then, so I headed out, like, you know, Black architects from all around the world. Everybody landed in Nigeria, in Abuja, and we spent our time at the beautiful Hilton there that you see on the top right. A week of great lectures, workshops, presentations. The Egyptians were really representing, of course, Hassan Fati, and they moved on and created all kinds of wonderful designs. So their presentations were great. But we had a great time. And at the end of the conference, we all load up in our tour buses to go and tour Abuja. Abuja is, at that time, Nigeria's brand new capital. They had moved from Lagos. And as some of you know, it was designed by Kenzo Tange, an American town planning firm. Beautiful city, designed and built for about 3 million people only, but it was nice and fresh then. So we're in the tour buses and we're going around, and the conductor is like, okay, look out to your window to the left. You see our beautiful national mosque designed and built by, and he would go on. And then you look to the right, you see our national cathedral designed and built by, and there is the wonderful Sheraton, modern architecture. And he's just talking away. He's just so excited. But it's real quiet. So he looks back at us, and we're looking at him, and we look out the window, and he's like, well, why aren't y'all taking any pictures? And people were like, well, we can't, because if we took pictures now and send them to our families and friends in America and Europe, they won't think we were in Africa. They would think we're just right next door. Where is the real Africa? Where's the African monumental architecture? And so the tour guide was like totally quiet, because he knew the only place he thought he could take us was probably to the village, but that's not where a busload of trained architects wanted to go, right? He knew what they were asking. I hope he knew what we were asking, But that was a very interesting situation. And so this is a short story of the importance and what registered to me when I was doing my research on what is African architecture, on my quest to defining African architecture. The second dichotomy was the fact that, or is the fact that Africa, there are two worlds. I identified there are two worlds. There's urban and then there's the rural, both as contemporary as you can imagine. Image on the left, Lagos, congested, all built up, great, that's Africa. Image on the right is also Africa. That's Africa today. There are people living just like that, probably for the past couple thousand years. They are as contemporary as the people on the left, right? They are designing and building these communities now. You can go into some of these communities and you see they've got, you know, TVs, cable, they're on their phones, contemporary. But these are two realities. So when we're talking about architecture for Africa and what the role of the architect be, who are your clients? Is it the guys on the left or is it the guys on the right? What are their needs? How are they really living, right? How can you contribute to their best experience? Both of these images represented architecture. This phase of my research was critical because at this point, I was trying to understand if Africa had continued to develop, right? Or if I'm looking for elements to create new architectural languages, right? Where would I start from? Do I necessarily want to go back all the way back to Egypt? Yes, good starting point. But what was the height of Africa's civilizations, right? So before the conquering and slave trade and colonization and all of that, how far had Africans actually gotten with the evolution of their architecture, their urban planning, all of that? So I can see, okay, this is them in their true identity. Of course, cultures share all the time. So it's not that architecture would be authentically African. They were travelers. So people came to Africa and Africans traveled out. So there will always be a fusion there. But looking at the height of African civilization, what are some of those elements that I could take and say, okay, from here, I will build upon, I will bring these to the table today, build upon, and of course, use for the future development of Africa. Africans practice oral tradition. So most of what I'm going to learn from those on ground today would be telling stories. But what I did realize that in the books kept by the travelers, I could see images of what they saw 300, 400, 500 years ago, right? The sketches from the travelers' journals were so critical. They became so important. These are images of the Kingdom of Benin, Congo, Kumasi. Just reading through these, they're describing African cities, I mean, well-planned. Streets were like well-planned, laid out boulevards, columns capped with copper, street lights, making Holland look like a ghetto. And then they start talking about burning them down and looting and setting them on fire, the destruction, right, of those nations and civilizations at that point. I gathered a lot of research from this era. And then the final was the era of independence, right? So 1950s and 60s, all over the world, African nations and people were gaining freedom in the West, the civil rights era. In Africa, starting with Ghana, I think in 57, Nigeria in 60s, of course, so many other countries, all the other countries starting to get their independence. And I was thinking, oh, wow, this was a great pivotal point for Africa. This would be that time that they could say, okay, now we're free. We're now able to think in our own identity again. Let's kind of pick back up from where we left off and then see how to move forward in a way that really works for us. And so here you have the independence era. And this is also when the universities are being built. Problem was, the curricula in the schools were all Eurocentric. So of course, for architecture, and this is for architecture, this medicine, politics, everything. Now you have the opportunity for Africans to start picking back up, but now we're thinking in a Eurocentric mindset, right? So for architecture, now we're building Europe in Africa. And it wasn't just the schools in Africa, it's schools everywhere. We're talking about architecture curricula, what are we learning? It's basically Eurocentric. So I understood where my professor might have had a point, right? If students of design are not learning the architecture of their people, of their culture, of their environment, of their place, their own aesthetics, their own affordability, what can you afford, right? You have to build for the economic base of your people. If you're not learning that in school, then what you are learning is other people's, right? So I understood what happened there. Okay, fine. So I made peace with that. But what I had at my own rescue was the fact that there were so many people that had come before me who had already championed this, who had already laid the foundation. I could learn from them, their publications, their architecture. I was in good company. I had people to lead the way. I was not lost. I was not alone. Starting with Dimas Wonko there on the top left, Nigeria's premier architect, builder, playwright. He's just an all-round genius creative. His work is recognized as the truest architecture of Nigeria. He reflected everything that had to do with his culture, his Igbo, and the surrounding cultures when he would go and design and build in other communities. Like we saw from that map, hundreds of ethnic groups, and they would have different identities, right? Different architectural languages. So Dimas had mastered this. Of course, again, Professor David Hughes, just his lectures, his research, his architecture, I had guidance. William Stanley, my first boss here in Atlanta, Georgia, he reflected Afrocentric architecture. He and David are friends. His construction in Atlanta reference Ethiopia, reference Egypt. I had him to look up to. Dr. Nnamdi Ele, his book, Afrocentric Architecture, Evolution, African Architecture, Evolution and Transformation, like David's book, Afrocentric Architecture, Design Primer, were Bibles. These were like 20, 25 years ago. This is what, you read these books and you just like, okay, I get it. I can connect the dots now and I know where to go from here, right? So having, of course, Phil Freelon, recent, we know his work, the Africanisms and retentions in African-American architecture. Okay, I was not alone. Pierre Atepa, many of you should know him, his monuments throughout Africa, all right? Studied his work. The newest kid on the block, kind of to say, I wasn't studying her 20 years ago, but Miriam Kamara. When you talk about African-inspired architecture, you have to start with her. Her story is phenomenal. So I had a wealth of research to guide me and to move forward in my quest for this Africa defining architecture. How did I respond to it? So in 2013, I'm in the US on sabbatical. Earlier I had moved back to Nigeria to do all of this research. And it came to me, all right, well, let's do a design competition. Let's kind of invite everybody to the table. Let's see if we could all do this. It's so much research. You've seen how the continent is divided, and it's so much. Welcome everybody to the table. Let's do the research and let's come up with our versions, right? Come up with some prototypes, but let's have this conversation together. So 2015, I launched CPDI Africa, right, which is a culture-inspired, research-based design-build initiative created to inspire the development of successful African and diaspora neighborhoods and communities with modern African architecture that is both culturally and environmentally sustainable. Okay, so again, the plan was to do these competitions and begin to popularize this conversation. I created the design brief and I realized, how are people going to respond to it if they hadn't been taught, right? So I knew I was going to have to do a lot of teaching and talking and put all of that in the design brief that will guide them. But the design brief was for a 3 to 4 bedroom bungalow, right? A house that would embody the elements. Pick what nation or ethnic group you want to celebrate that will embody their research. And that traditional research will be translated into a contemporary prototype. You would blend technology, sustainability, and whatever other elements of the culture that you are now living in or experiencing. So if you're in Asia, if you're in America, add some of that and then produce. The idea was to make sure that this was easy to design and easy to build. It should cost less than $50,000 because we wanted it to be affordable. We wanted it to be, affordable to anybody, kind of anybody in Africa. And 3, there are now 5 of the elements that they had to focus on were true. How do you reflect culture and lifestyle, which now includes spirituality? How do you reflect aesthetics? How are you using local materials? And then what is the process, right? What is the process of building this architecture? Does it have to be designed and built by highly trained professionals that you have to pay? Or will this be a community engagement, people coming together to help each other to build how Africans typically built, right? You want to build your house and you call your family and friends and we all help you build, and then you celebrate with a feast, and then when it's my turn, you all come help me, right? So this is going to be a community effort, or we're going to be paying people, right? So how are you going to achieve this building your prototype, right? So what did we do? We took our story on the road. We had think tanks, we had lectures, workshops, trying to get everybody ready and prepared for them to respond to our design brief in our competition. So let me give you an idea of some of the information that you have to have, right, in order to create something that is African inspired. Simple, again, it's people's culture and their aesthetics and their lifestyle and materials and geography, all of those things reflected into the built environment. And so when you do that for people in a place, you will create something that is unique for them. So the first thing we talked about trying to teach was aesthetics. This is the ECOWAS building, designed and built by Pierre Goudiabe Atepa. It's in Lomé, Togo. The ECOWAS building is where the West African heads of states meet when they're having meetings, deliberations, everything. It's a seat of power. The current building is in Abuja, Nigeria. When you look at the elements on the objects on the left, you see the Ghanaian stool. Maybe you're familiar with the golden stool, right? That object is a seat of power. There's power attached to that object, right? The Egyptian headdress, also seat of power. So this is where the pharaohs will rest their heads, right? You don't put your head on the floor. The head is a carrier of wisdom, so you lift your head up. These pillows were very uncomfortable, but they housed wisdom, right? So the headdress housed with wisdom. The Ghanaian stool sat power. So these are objects of power, resting places of power. The ECOWAS building was the seat of power. So you see how you could draw the correlation between these two, right? Heads of states are meeting, a building that's inspired by an object that says seat or headquarters of power. You see the connection, right? So you're coming up with architectural forms. What can you draw inspiration from in terms of objects, art, artifacts? This was a good example. We shared, we taught. And this building has, of course, has modern patterns and motifs. So there was more going on with that inspiration. On this building, of course, we all know what Phil Freelon and his team did with the Smithsonian, drawing inspiration from the Yoruba totem pole there on the left, the corona, the headdress, as you can see, contemporary headdress for women in West Africa, the gele, which you can see on the bottom there, those 3 examples. Drawing inspiration again from aesthetics. He also has on the grill the patterns and motifs from the quilts from the Gullah Geechee. which is also an Africanism. So aesthetic-wise, there's lots to draw from, and examples do exist, and it is possible. More aesthetics, you can see on the bottom right in CPD, which we saw in the movie Black Panther. It was used for the alphabet, for the language that was used, an evolved form of NCPD. And you see Ashanti patterns, motifs, Igbo, Uli patterns. You see the image there on the far top left, the woman painting the Uli on the building. It was often women's work to do the interior and exterior decoration. The paint was all organic, right? So it comes from flowers, from fruits, from barks of trees, totally organic paint. So they would do the work after the men had constructed the buildings. And you could see, based on what ethnic group or what nation you're from, your patterns would have different spiritual meanings. Some of them would be purely decorative. But these were some of the aesthetics that we taught about, again, preparing those to join our competition. You also see some of those patterns on that fabric there on the left. Just more examples of how these aesthetics were applied. And it's not just a pattern, the form and shape. We all know that the circle has spiritual meaning in Africa, also is structurally more sound. But you see the buildings there, they're molded by hand. They were molded by hand. It's very organic, right? It's very alive, very warm. And so it's like the perfection in the imperfection, right? We do see those square edges there in the bottom left, but most often the architecture of Africa was warm and rounded, right? It was molded, it was organic. We pulled together these collages, we call them country collages. There's one on the left from Kenya, one from South Africa. We pulled jewelry, fabric, sculpture, art, of course, architecture, patterns. We pulled together a collection of these so that the architects could see, again, visuals. When somebody sees your building, will they be able to identify with it just based on what they're seeing, right? Visuals just has, anybody can look at a group of people and tell just by how they look where they may come from, right? Aesthetics is important. So architecturally, we would do the same thing. I should be able to drive through a neighborhood and identify, like we showed the Chinatown example. Okay, I keep seeing this Adinkra symbol. It's abstracted. Okay, this one is the original version. I'm seeing it in the shape of the building or the door, the window treatment, sculpture out front. Something is pulling me to Ghana. I keep seeing this symbol, this aesthetic, this form, right? How many years does it take for us to agree at the end of the day that this aesthetic represents us in the built environment? Okay, so this was the value of this part. We also did some sample prototypes to inspire, to show that this is what we're talking about. This design is by Kopji Golit, one of our amazing architects from Abuja. He drew inspiration from the traditional building on the top left there. We pulled collages of people in their traditional wear. And we just worked through different prototypes. And like I said, this pattern, if you were from this particular ethnic group, when you see this, do you recognize that, oh, this must be a home of somebody from my ethnic group, right? That's my culture. Or, oh, I'm proud of my culture, I want to represent that. So this is how I could display it. We did evolutions. Top left, traditional Igbo architecture. You see the then, before then, and now. This is Dimas Wonko's private villa in Idumujiboko, Delta State, Nigeria. You can see just truly pulling on Igbo inspiration for his home in this image. So we did a lot of these collages as well. All right, so that was aesthetics. The second was culture and spirituality. Now, these are the foundations, right? If you can't identify what your culture is, how you live, what's important to you, how you use space, then you'll have no idea, of course, what to build for that, because you're building for what you do, right? And that's what sets us all apart. Do we live outside? Do we live inside? What's this indoor-outdoor living thing? who appreciates the saying, who needs to stay on the inside based on climate, right? But how do we use space? That will dictate what we build. And for African people, spirituality is the foundation. You can't get away from that at all. It just starts and ends with spirituality. So we began talking about that. Many of you are familiar with Francis Carey's school in Burkina Faso. He talked about getting the contract to do the school in the village. He goes back and the townspeople are saying, well, you know, when our children learn, the ancestors must be there. So when you're designing your school, please make sure that you don't block them out, right? So students are only sitting in these rooms where there's doors and windows and the ancestors are being, no. So he came up with this series of alternating outdoor learning spaces and indoor learning spaces. So the students will go between the spaces, and at some point during the day, the ancestors will be sitting there with them as they partake in their learning sessions. This is not 2,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago. This is now. You can't say that, oh, Africans have passed that, or it's too outdated, savage, old, whatever. No, this is being practiced today. And so an architect working in a community would have to understand the priorities and what's important to his clients. This image is much closer to home. This is actually my family compound or family home in Iseluku, Delta State, Nigeria. This is my grandfather's house. It was built in the 20s. There are a couple of things I'll say about this. Culture, once again. So we all know that Africans are typically polygamous. And we may not be that now. Most people may not be that now, but then somehow, kind of, sort of, we still are. But in this era, my grandfather had 3 wives, right? And so your typical house layout in Africa, let's talk about Iseluku right now, will be a collection of rooms around a courtyard, right? So people think, oh, that round building that people call huts, bad word. That round oval is the house. No, that's a room, right? So you have all of these rooms around the courtyard. The husband has the original man cave. He has his own space, right? And then his wives, the first wife will have her room, right? Her own round building, the second wife, the third wife, and the fourth thing go like that. And then the girls will have theirs and the boys. And then you have spaces for, you know, the family members. Of course, grandmas, grandpas were always there, uncles, cousins. Of course, there'll be spaces for the animals and all that. And they'll be all around the courtyard. And the courtyard was the living room, right? You only go into your room to sleep. Most Africa, life happens outside. That whole indoor-outdoor relationship was crucial. So this is 1920s. My grandfather is educated and he's building his new house and he decides he's gonna do something modern. So this building is clay, but he puts everybody under one roof. So you go into my grandfather's house and you will see his bedroom. You will see my grandmother's bedrooms, right? So my grandmother had hers, her co-wife had hers, right? The office, living room. The living room was in the center. It was like the courtyard space, but of course it's covered now. And that's where, in the living room, is where, how many of them? Like more than 18 children. They all slept on the floor in the living room. So that's one way how culture is reflected, right? So modern day polygamy is practiced a little different. You might not have all your wives in one house. You might have one wife on that part of town and the other wife, right? Okay, so polygamy is culture. And so you reflect that in the built environment. Just look at African architecture, you see it everywhere. So that was the first thing I like to say about this. The second thing is actually the most important. So in this home, my grandfather is buried. He's buried in the living room. It is tradition, it is typical, it is current day practice for the head of the household to be buried in his home. I was a teenager when my grandfather passed. We were having the 2-week-long ceremony. And when it came time to bury him, we all had to move out the house. And then these people who it's their job to come in and bust up the living room floor came in and did just that. And then they laid my granddad to rest. A couple of days later, the house had gone through its spiritual reckoning and we all moved back in. And I said, okay, and so this is how we do, all right? I was a teenager, that's fine, that's normal. It becomes part of regular life. I'm fine with that, it's part of the culture, and I understand that most of the houses in my hometown are living mausoleums, right? Everybody's buried in their house, right? So a father belongs to his first son, a mother belongs to her second son, right? So when the mother passes, the second son will build her a home where she'll be buried, typically right behind the family home. Or she could build it for herself if she doesn't have a second son, or different things could happen. But this is tradition. And so a lot of times people who are coming in to come and develop, you know, in Africa, Nigeria, Iseleku, we're talking about, oh, it's going to be so hard to develop here because you can't move houses because the whole town is one big cemetery. Well, that's just part of life. And so if you're an architect and you're going to get a contract to build something for a client in Iseleku, it is important that you know this, right? And so you will be mindful of reflecting that in your design. So I would say, how do you translate this traditional element or practice into contemporary? Well, while you're designing and building, you can ask your client, okay, so sir or ma'am, where would you like to be buried? Is it in the living room or is it in your bedroom? And then you can go ahead and pre-design that burial chamber. You close it over with the trap door, put your tile, put your carpet. And then when that fateful day comes, right, you just pull everything back, you know, move the tile out the way, and then you bury, right? As opposed to all the financial damage that typically happens when you start busting up the floor. This is an example, right? And I say this because, again, this is not 2,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 100 years ago. This is right now. When my father became an ancestor 4 years ago, we went through the same process of having to destroy the living room floor. And of course, I let my family members know that any house going forward that we do, we're not doing this. We're doing this the contemporary modern way. We're going to pre-design. This is no need wasting money, right? Pulling up the floor. So that is the story behind this. Again, spirituality and culture reflected. And what is the spiritual element? The fact that most Africans believe in this cycle of life, right? So this is continued conversation between the living, the dead, and those yet to come, right? And so having your loved one buried there in the house, they're always part of the family, right? So when you see people pouring libation, I know that's an Africanism that we now have in the diaspora. It came over with us. But when you see somebody pouring libation in Africa, they really mean they're pouring that, they're offering water or food to the ancestor that's actually buried there. Right? It's respect. You kneel and you talk to them. I do that when I go home to my village. When I want to talk to my father, I kneel by his side in the living room, right? My father told us before he passed that my great granddad is also buried in his house in the dining room. Who knew? So wow, that's part of the story. So we talk about materials and sustainability, crucial. As you all can know, you can't do without this one. It was so interesting during the COVID pandemic thing with borders shut down, people who were relying on materials coming from outside, their construction industry got halted, right? If you can't get material, why are you using materials that are coming from elsewhere to build your own communities, right? Interesting question. So let's talk about materials and the work of Dimas Wonko. These are only a couple of images. You gotta visit his buildings to get the full picture and understanding of what that genius does with architecture. But what I'll talk about here is his use of materials that he harvests from site, right? So he's building something, he's digging up his clay or his laterite, he's digging that up from site and he's making his bricks. We know that Africa is hot. We understand the colonial legacy and Africans not being allowed to use clay to build in the cities that were being developed during that era. The requirement that you build with cement that at that time was being imported. We all know Africa is hot. Our ancestors knew that if you build with clay, adobe, mud, laterite, any of those, that you keep the heat out. When you have a clay building, the inside of that building is quite cool, right? So building with cement and those corrugated iron roofs like we see all around Africa, you're literally building an oven. and you're cooking yourself in there, right? So forget about the fact whether you have power or you're having to run your air conditions with diesel. Everybody has a private generator. You can imagine the cost and expense. Oh, what could your comfort level be like if you had a clay building that actually kept your house cool, right? So he knew all this, and his story is amazing. I mean, he went to School of Architecture, you know, in the 50s, and got there. And at that time, like I said, universities were being set up by the former colonial nations. And he gets to school, and the young British architects were teaching British architecture. And he was thinking, well, what does this have to do with, this is not how these square boxes that they're designing and teaching us, that's not how we live. That's not going to work here. I mean, so he quit design school and he went and he finished in art. But because he's a natural architect, his buildings just speak volumes. He knew from working in Uboko, working with his dad, who was the king, helping to build architecture in his community, that you build out of clay. And the arrangements are, like I said, you have your courtyards and these rooms are around them. The closed living room is a Western concept. The living room is an open space for most parts of Africa. So anyway, he builds with clay. This is his Kenzwa Cultural Center in Benin City. You have got to experience this building. The right is his family residence. He has a courtyard, his own version of a courtyard. It's got an impluvium. That spout there is open to the sky. When it rains, it's beautiful. That plant there is living forever because it's being nurtured. All right. He's a master of ventilation. He keeps his house. So even though his buildings are all clay, he does utilize the courtyard concept all over his buildings. There are courtyards everywhere. And so you see that air can flow in and up and out. It's such a pleasant experience. So these are just two, talking about materials and also, once again, culture. This image, love it because when you talk about traditional African architecture, everybody says, oh my goodness, it's so primitive. It's mud. Oh, who wants that? It's savage. It's backwards. You look at the images on the left. Oh my God, I don't want that. But you look at the image on the right. This one was done by Roman Gorshkov, one of our 2015 competition applicants. That building is rammed earth. It's the same material that you see on the left, but it's just designed differently. It's kind of contemporary. So everybody wanted this building when I would show it, right? It's the same architecture, right? It's arranged differently, but those materials, he knew. You're building in Africa. Rammed earth is just ideal, right? And it wasn't just the materials he used. He has courtyards all through this. That chimney you see is not for heat. That's for grilling suya. That's that outdoor barbecuing people are always doing on the continent, right? So there's a gathering space and for enjoying with family and friends. But again, focusing on materials. How do we standardize our local building materials? How do architects begin to be trained to use those materials in a way that will make people proud, to use quote unquote local materials that they've decided are ancient and old and outdated and only for the village, right? This building is Anywheresville, Africa. It's the city, it's the rural, urban areas, rural areas, it works. Just another example of traditional architecture. So you're talking about rural architecture. People could say, how can we move from what we see on the left to where we are on the right? It's a gradual process. I could do another story about when they were designing and building Abuja. They were leaving Lagos and coming to Abuja because Lagos was now congested. So they moved to the middle of the country. They moved all the villagers or indigenous people away. Kento Tange and his team designed a wonderful Abuja, and it was again for the wealthy. But they did allow some of the indigenous people to come back, and they built them these 2-bedroom bungalows made out of cement with these corrugated iron roofs. They built them ovens. So the people moved in, and within a couple of weeks, they realized they couldn't survive here. They moved out. They moved to the backyard and they rebuilt their traditional buildings. And then they realized, we're just going to move further out. And they sold their houses to civil servants. How do you take architecture a couple of levels up as you're having people progress, right? So some of the images on the right could work. It's architecture, it's the same materials, designed a little differently. You can still place them around the courtyard. But I have this in here just for us to think through as designers, how do we provide architecture for everyone? All right, so enough of the teaching. We launched our competition. We had great responses from all over the world. These are some of our winners from 2015 and 2017. We have another one coming up in 2021. Top first place winners were Aisha Aminu from Nigeria and Nmadili Okwumabua from Vietnam. We'll talk about the architecture. Like I said, designs came in from all around the world. Thank goodness for the invention of the internet, because I don't know how we would have reached everybody. But people responded. They were really excited to join. And people wanted their names, of course, also to go down in history as, oh yeah, we helped define and create modern African architecture. This came in from Nmadili Okwumabua, as I said, the first place winner from 2015, drew inspiration from Mali. She did not go to Mali to do her research. She read books, taught herself. Rammed Earth, key point from this was, she said, doing her research, she found solutions to urban problems that they're facing in Vietnam today that Africans had solved 2,000 years ago and had forgotten. And she was packaging this research and this information to take to her planning development office to say, look at solutions, some of our problems. There's a wealth of information. I mean, Africans have been around since day one. So of course they've solved a lot of the issues that we face. So getting that information now and applying it will do all of us a lot of good. But again, she used rammed earth. She had plants in her courtyard that purified the air. Pages long, and we'll go back to that when we get through with this. This design came from a civil engineer student, actually from Russia. An amazing piece. She drew on 4 different African masks, right? Pulling on spirituality, right? So we know that in Africa, art is not for art, it's not just art for art's sake. Every piece had a meaning, and most often was a spiritual meaning. So we know when we put on our masks, and we're not we, when those who are called to wear those masks and perform, they're invoking ancestors, spirits, fertility, wealth, luck, good life. All of these things are being are embedded in these masks, and they have different names, and of course they're very diverse from all over the continent. So she took 4 and she created her building. Each facade was inspired by a different mask. And it was just powerful. Now, the reason why she didn't win, because she blew her budget. I'm not sure you can achieve this with $50,000, but it was a very beautiful piece, and we use it for a lot of our marketing. Second place winner 2017 by 2 Yoruba architects from Nigeria. This live workspace was inspired by the calabash, by fertility. It was a high rise. Again, mixed use, motherhood, fertility, history, security, beauty. It was an amazing presentation, and also utilized a lot of sustainable elements. Ifa House by Eduardo Soto, from Puerto Rico, pulling on his Yoruba ancestry. As we know, all Africans in diaspora most of them are from West Africa. So he pulled on his Yoruba roots, did a lot of amazing research. The pillars, the columns in his living room holding up his roof, his open courtyard there, were inspired by the posts and pillars from Yoruba palatial architecture. Roman Gorshkov, once again, that's his floor plan. You're seeing it's 2 separate buildings. You see all the shapes, squares, circles, your courtyard, your cooking space on the interior. You see where he drew his inspiration from, the image on the bottom right. Rammed earth, once again, inspired by Ethiopia and West Africa. Sanidara from Republic of Benin. He was the one that used the most popular forms that we're used to, the round shapes surrounding a courtyard. He uses burnt brick. Celebrated family. Another close-up. Zainab from Nigeria. Most women loved her design. The spatial arrangement was very comfortable, inspired by Northern Africa and Northern Nigerian architecture. She used clay brick, she used cement, she used bamboo, wrought iron for the decor there in the front. You see it's a flat roof, so it's adapted to its location. So this northern part of Nigeria, Hausa architecture, the climate, you don't need a steep roof if it's not raining, right? So she truly reflected material, culture, and location. This one, a favorite by all artists. When I saw this, I was like, I thought I asked them to send me something modern and contemporary. What is this? I'm so happy I kept it, because this one got us a trip to Germany. Went there for a week to teach German developers what to build when coming to develop in Africa. That was an amazing experience. This image, we had it on show at an exhibition in Abuja, and so these German developers were there, and it came to our booth and they were like, what is that? So it can be built. It's been developed for thousands of years. You can look at the image on the bottom right. There are architects and master builders, local ones, that still have this information and this knowledge. They will be happy to speak with students of architecture or trained licensed architects if they said, okay, we want to come and learn and see how to do this and take this to the next level, right? But this design was submitted by 3 design students from EIABC in Ethiopia. Again, it's the favorite by all artists. When they see this, they love it. This was submitted by Professor Akande, an art historian professor from the University of Lagos, the Irele. He pulled on traditional Yoruba and Ashanti pattern. Solar energy, he used clay, he used logs. Of course, our pattern is there. We see our 2 deities sitting there at the front door waiting to welcome us as we go into the house. Another amazing one, inspired by Northern Nigeria. You look at this, they spoke of architecture that responds to the sandstorms, right? So a beautiful piece. I love that. It's called the Desert Wave. You see that front facade, the wave. Lovely, lovely floor plan, and you can see what inspired them. Again, they're using clay. Beautiful piece from 2015. And then what did we do? We packaged, those are just a few of the images, and we'll talk about some more of them later. We packaged our architecture in an exhibition called The Art of African Architecture. We took it on a road show so people could see what we were talking about and become sensitized to this conversation. We called it art because after all, architecture is an art. But we knew that African art already being appreciated by just about everybody. If you package it as African art, people will be willing to listen and engage. What was very important about our traveling this exhibition around the world was the people's response. First, they were thrilled. We kept getting, this is so amazing. How come I've never seen this before? How come architects don't create this kind of architecture? Oh my God, my culture represented in a building. How can I get one of these? Where are you building these? Oh my God, this is so beautiful. What a breath of fresh air. We knew we'd succeeded. If they had said, oh my God, no, this is savage and it's primitive, you know, the usual that we hear about African architecture. No, this is not acceptable. Then we say, okay, fine, we failed. Professor, you were right. It's not possible to put Black Africa and architecture in the same sentence. But that is not what happened. This is the Inara by Aisha Aminu, our winner from 2017. This piece has an amazing story behind it. We'll look at that. But the Art of African Architecture traveled. This publication, this is where you will see, and let me just go say that now. So everything that I'm not saying, you will find it here, at least for the 2015 competition. You can go to the Digital Commons and download the 25 submissions, read all about them, see what inspired the architects. We are looking to publish 2017 soon. And of course, like I said, we're having another one coming up in 2021. If you want to hear the architects in their own words, go to our Facebook page. You will hear from Eduardo Soto for the Ifa House. You will hear Aisha Aminu in her own voice for the Inara House, and several of other of the videos. Watch what inspired them. It just expands the story. We continue to do lectures to carry this message around. Now, the best way to do this is on virtual global studios. But we do the workshops and the lectures, we do tours, again, to popularize the conversation until the universities and, even high schools, but until the academy is ready to really, really incorporate this research and incubate it on their platforms, the conversation may have to live outside of academia, but only for a short while, because we do see the changes that are coming. And so what are we trying to do? We're rounding up now. What are we trying to do? We want universities, just like our school here, to incubate this research. As Africa is coming online, they say is the last frontier. It needs to be developed. It'll be great to develop Africa in her own identity, of course, modern, contemporary, make it sustainable, everything, right? But we have to bring that into institutions of higher learning so that students can master this by the time they graduate with their 5-year degree or master's or PhD. Be well-versed in your language. Be well-versed in how to graduate and go and give back to your community, right? Don't be trained in a way where when you now come back to your community, you can't help. Right? Africans, yeah, should be the richest people, but they're kind of not. So if they're not wealthy, then you have to create architecture that meets them where they are. How do we do that? We need to learn that in the universities. So we take the story to the schools. Students, of course, professors are wanting to engage. We offer this information. Architects, of course, making this an option for your clients. Product manufacturers, right? Who's standardizing local building materials so that it's affordable and it works? Developers, architecture is commodified through real estate. So what are the developers building? How do we encourage them to look at these options? Urban planners, of course, those who are making those policies. If you can make policy, and I could tell some more stories about that, let's not today. But yes, when you have planning officials saying that in order to get your building approval, we must see that it reflects a certain percentage of culture, sustainability, affordability. You can't just import, copy, paste, whatever. So planners are those gatekeepers. Let's get them to the table. And of course, our clients, if they see it and they love it and they see this is a great option, right? It's going to save them on costs. It's going to promote their culture. They're proud of who they are. Let's sensitize everybody and get this mission achieved. These are just some of our posters. We do tours. We take architects and architecture connoisseurs around. 2019, Professor David Hughes and I toured Nigeria and Cameroon. My two mentors, David Hughes and Dimas Wanko, and of course, architect Joseph Conte, who is from Sierra Leone, who was my co-curator on last year's trip to Dimas Wanko. And that was an incredible experience. Of course, we visited most of his buildings. Where are we this very second? We are running internships. Our global studio had our trial run, our pilot run this summer. We had architects from the Pan-African experience join us, and their goal was to become experts, specializing in the architecture of their own culture. So if you come to the studio and you happen to be Luo or you're Haitian or you're Yoruba, you come in and you try to teach yourself and teach us, right? There's no way I can talk about every single language in Africa. So you come in and you teach us and we teach ourselves. So we had the students, interns come in, and we graduated our first 10 a couple of weeks ago. So a shout out to Ikechukwu, Wutza, Fawaz, Nomi, John, Udochukwu, Chibuzo, Hawa, Kirby, and Umar. So congratulations on that. These are just a few of the designs that came out of our studio. They had to build a design, of course, architecture that reflected their culture and identity. And so this is some of what came out of the studio. Was really incredible architecture. This one by architect Fawaz Adelaja. Just incredible. And we're sharing some of that on our social media platforms. So tune in, we're gonna be focusing or featuring them and all they learned and contributed to the platform, how this impacted their lives. So we'll be sharing all that. If you follow us, you'll see them, see their animations and their research, which is, you know, of crucial importance. So as I end, I like to say that the pyramids were just the beginning, right? They were just the beginning. We could go really far if we continue to create architecture, right, that celebrates identity. And for Africa, for it to continue to grow and develop in its own image. Architects and planners, this is a great job, great opportunity for us. This studio is opening that door, hearing global voices, and welcoming everybody to the table to achieve our collective goal. Everybody gets to benefit from what Africa has to contribute to the discourse of contemporary architecture. Africa, after all, was 1,000% sustainable and green and eco-friendly. So how do we bring that thousands of years of architectural science to the table today? So welcome everyone to the conversation. If you check out our website, you can go there and engage, register to engage with us in different ways, competitions, publications, our trips to Africa, our courses. And yeah, thank you very much. I have truly enjoyed sharing with you today.
Thank you, Nmadili. So we'll start taking some questions from the audience soon. Sam and I will be moderating the chat box. So if you do have any questions to ask Nmadili, we have about 10 minutes to bombard her with a few difficult questions. I've been looking at the chat box throughout your talk at Nmadili, and there's been a very interesting discussion and an open discussion on culture, identity, power. So I will send you a transcript of this chat box because I think you'll find it very interesting. I don't think you had enough time to follow this chat box while you were talking. At the same time, myself, I think that Afrofuturism that you showed, the images of that you showed were very inspiring. I'd just like to take a second to also acknowledge Chadwick Boseman, who passed away recently, and some of the image he showed. You know, I think he was an inspiration to a lot of us, and how film also inspires so many and affects so many of us through culture. Also, the project that you showed by the Smithsonian, we had the chance to also see David Adjaye present that project in Alberta last year. So I think many of us are also very familiar with that project. And I think if we could also be involved with your competitions and tours in the future with our students, I think we'd love to continue talking with you. So Sam,
thank you.
Open up the question box and see what we have there.
So yeah, Nmadili, that was a great lecture. Thank you for that, and thank you for the inspiration. There are definitely lots of questions, and like Henry did mention, I think you'll be delighted to see the transcript. Now, I guess the first question for you is, with all this awareness about African architecture, what are the low-hanging fruits, right? That you can, talk about in terms of what to do. Yes, there's been, you did mention practitioners should exhibit these languages in their various projects, which is great. But what are some of the low-hanging fruits that you think maybe, I mean, there's a lot of emphasis on curriculum, right? Awareness, and all that, which is there. But in terms of practicality with people that are practicing right now, with organizations like the South African Institute of Architects or South African Institute for Architecture, like they call it now, the Nigerian Institute of Architects, Commonwealth, all these organizations, what are those low-hanging fruits that CPDI will kind of like recommend?
Okay. Well, actually, you've kind of said it. It's curriculum development, right? It's actually teaching. honestly, I thought by now, I mean, I've actually been on this for 20 plus years. CPDI and the competitions only came about 5 years ago. I thought by now I would have been building, and everybody else, not just me, because I can't build it all, right? That I would have had just tons of structures up, right? Just African-inspired architecture everywhere. I thought the phone would be ringing and people were calling, yes, design, 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 build, build, build. Where we are actually, I mean, to find myself now teaching, it's teaching, it's talking, it's sensitizing everyone to this conversation. You can't do anything unless people actually believe, right? Pretty pictures is one thing, but building yes is another, but you can't get to building until you've convinced people that this is worthy. This actually has value. The teaching element is crucial. You could talk about this for forever. I mean, you mentioned NIA. I'm just so proud. I'm so happy that that's the Nigerian Institute of Architects, that they're now engaging this conversation, right? My interns, I mean, you have people crying in class because they're learning things about themselves, and when you have people believing that nothing good could have come out of Africa, nothing good, definitely, when talk about architecture, again, try and put Black African architecture in the same sentence, and there's a problem. Just getting that out of our minds. And so that the low hanging fruit really is teaching. It's what we're doing right now in this global studio. It's presenting this conversation to ourselves. Lectures, workshops, that's the first thing. Because when people now begin to see, are you looking for sustainable solutions to problems? Oh, here's a whole list of them. If you don't know about them, you don't know about them, but you have to know. And the only way you're going to know is if you're taught. So we have to have those lectures, those workshops. We have to travel this conversation around. We do have to have more competitions. We do have to package them as exhibitions. And of course, yes, present them to those who believe, and those who have the funds. If you're talking about large scale projects like museums, cultural centers, resorts, especially hospitality industry, they would appreciate this kind of architecture, right? Because like what we saw when we were traveling on Abuja and no one was taking pictures, right? A lost opportunity for architects from that region to really display, I mean, tourism. So it's talking, teaching, presenting those prototypes, presenting them in those exhibition formats, and presenting them to those who have the power, right, to make a difference. Yeah.
And maybe a follow-up question to that. I do know that, I mean, there are probably a few professors from Nigeria on this call that I could see. I see the likes of Yakubu Aminu Dudu from Malaysia and the rest. But one thing I did notice, most curriculum in schools of architecture in Africa do have a portion on history of architecture, right, as part of their curriculum. But when you look at the content of that history of architecture, it will seem as if the history is actually dominated by the Eurocentric, kind of teaching. Whereas, the works of the likes of Nmadili, the triple heritage, and all what have you, is kind of like, difficult to include in the formal, architectural curriculum. Is there any effort whatsoever? I do know that there's various association of, teachers. Is there any effort, so far that you're aware of? Maybe, Yakubu can kind of chime in to bring and sensitize the students about, the history, right? The awareness before we move on, at least starting from that curriculum, that simple curriculum.
Okay, Architect Dodo, are you unmuted?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Nmadili and Professor Obo. Actually, currently, we've been working tremendously with Professor Nmadili and the Association of Educators, Researchers in Nigeria. We are trying to revamp the curriculum in such a way that CPDI can come in. Likewise, in the AAF that we are trying to organize, I have spoken to Nmadili that we want CPDI to be, CPDI to be like, we have a collaboration with CPDI in Ahmadu Bello University to see most of the historical documentation we have already, and to see how we can incorporate African traditional architecture. Actually, from what you have said, Architect Obo, we need to revamp the curriculum. It's a curriculum-based thing. If we revamp the curriculum, then we make history, Afrocentric architecture, to be like a prerequisite. When it becomes a prerequisite, then we can move on. Then sensitizing practitioners, and it goes on like that. It's not an easy task because the change, change is a constant, but the resistance to change. So we need a lot of effort. We need a lot of sensitization workshop like this from time to time. But in terms of curriculum, we are seriously working on that. And I believe the archists have a series of workshop, and Nmadili, she's coming on board soon in the second segment of our webinar. And soon we will roll out programs that we see CPDI Africa with Nmadili University and other schools of architecture in Nigeria playing the front row to see how we can bring African architecture to limelight.
Okay, so that's on the curriculum, aspect. Thank you about that. I know you did talk about West Africa, but I know similar effort is happening in Southern Africa and also in East Africa, and and in the northern parts of Africa. But where I was going with this point in terms of the awareness from the curriculum is also to take cue from what happened with the fashion industry in Africa. Why can't architecture be just like the fashion? Because when you go to, it's very easy, it's an identifiable feature that you see the whole, fashion industry. Why is it easier for, I know very few Africans that go to the tailor to say, hey, I need you to, design something for me. And if they design a suit for them, they'll reject it. So why is that not the case when it comes to, hey, architect, I want you to design a house for me. And if you design something that looks like, the house they have in the village, they see that as a symbol of poverty. Is there something you can say about that? And
I can say something. I want to take a leap from the Malaysian industry. Early 2010, when green building started, in Malaysia, they only had 3 green building, 3 examples of green building. So it's a thing of policy. The Malaysian government made it a theme of policy of construction of green buildings. As I speak, the Malaysian as a nation have more than 300 green building design, so to speak. Similarly can be done to African traditional architecture. Policy from the government. Government will make sure that any major construction must be in line with Afrocentric. This is my personal and humble opinion. Policy for government.
That's correct.
Yeah, so we need 3 things: awareness, technology, and policy. But policy comes at the top. So if the government say any building more than 50 million from the government should be totally Afrocentric.
Right. That's like I said, influencing the policymakers, urban planners. They're the gatekeepers. Once you say that it's mandatory, right? I could give a story about Ethiopia, why I had so many Ethiopian architects on the 2015 competition, that their government was saying that they did want to preserve their culture. So if you were going to get a building approval, your building permits, they had to see that you had preserved some of that cultural identity there. So a very good one, Architect Dodo. And to add to your answer there, Sam, what I realized is, yes, everybody else gets to feature their identity in their creative arts. You said fashion, of course, music, movies, now all that. For the architects, it's so much harder. I wish that architecture just, was affordable, like having a tailor to do a suit for you. You have to have money, right? And so, yes, people are building. So if you are going to build, yes, why don't you ask your architect to do a contemporary version of something that's traditional? Yes, but they will only know that if they've seen some examples. They will only know that if their architect gives them maybe 2 options. This is the European option, and this is the one that celebrates your culture. right? The architect will only know to do that if they have been trained, if they've been exposed to it, if they believed in it, right? The local building materials would have to be standardized so that if the architect specs those materials, he can actually get them, right? The planners have to be okay with it. So when that building approval gets to his table, he will approve it and not kick it back and say, this is not appropriate, right? So there's so many things that have to happen in order for that client to be able to say, yeah. Like Lolo was saying now, I mean, yes, you teach traditional architecture in many schools, but it can't end there. If you have one class that teaches traditional architecture, then the next class has to be contemporary translation of that architecture that you just learned, right? So you don't just stop there with the traditional. Let the students go through experimenting on how you translate that in a modern way. So all of these things have to happen in order for the client to say, design something that represents my Xhosa identity, my Zulu, my Ashanti, my Igbo, my Urhobo. Culture and heritage.
No, that's excellent. There's a number of talk around policy, but one of the things that was just mentioned is the whole idea of mandating, right? You know, the mandating that architects should do it. I think for a lot of us that live in Canada here, will find that very troublesome, right? You know, you cannot legislate good behavior. You cannot legislate, you know, things. You want to really encourage, you know, a situation where people voluntarily, right, speak. When you start mandating things like that, I think it becomes very problematic in a very democratic society. So maybe, you know, when suggestions around what to do around that, if there are practical examples, because there's nothing as going back to the grassroots, right, to get people to embrace, you know, what the whole concept of African architecture is, just the way they embrace. Fashion was really never mandated, right? You know, but people embraced it, that I want to dress, that's my identity. And I think there's a lot to be learned around that. So somehow the whole idea of legislating, you know, the style of architecture is very problematic anyway. It's not any different from what's happening in the United States right now, where the Trump administration is actually mandating, you know, the use of classical architecture in certain buildings, and the American Institute of Architects is saying, no, you can't do that. That kills creativity. So I think that's the point. I don't know, Henry, if there is any other question, right?
At the moment, there aren't specific questions. There is one that came up right now. It is by Nomagugu. He says, it is also important to stop being apologetic about our culture and who we are, what we represent. That needs to be made normal. And how do we do that?
Yeah, again, I think it's, you know, when I showed the slide of what happened after independence, I mean, you really, if people are sending their children to school to learn and to create an identity, because you're not getting it at home anymore. Prior to that, everybody used to homeschool their kids, right? So you have to be in an environment that's truly teaching you the positives about your culture, your identity, and empowering you to be positive about your identity. And once you're secure in that, then you won't be apologetic. You cannot be in a system where the only thing you see about yourself is something negative. You're always being defined by something negative. You have to tell your own story. You have to just know who you are. And so it starts from there. What are we teaching our children in school? What's being discussed at the dinner table? Is it always somebody else's story? Or is there a positive story about you? And so once you have that, you know, things that begin to change. You have to focus on the teaching of your own community to your children, to your students. And so you end up not having to mandate. If all of a sudden planners and government, you know, they're seeing that, oh my God, every other plan that comes in is talking about this. Oh, every plan that's coming in is reflecting some kind of culture and identity, using sustainable materials, right? Still modern, contemporary, but oh, this is what the people want. Just like, you know, Sam said, nobody has to mandate fashion or mandate juju music or robot dub from Jamaica, hip hop from the diaspora. Nobody has to mandate that. If it's coming from the people, it will get built. But again, it starts with the training. If we are not exposed to that in school and at our dinner tables, we won't know how to create these new architectural languages for our clients.
Yeah. And I think another way of putting it, Nmadili, is what you're trying to say also is like the African adage, until the lions start writing their own story, the account you always hear is the account of, you know, the hunter, right? You know, that's, yeah. So it's really very important, you know, that there's that awareness. But in addition, right, to that awareness that we talked about, the practicality, you know, of it is very important. Your presentation talked about the Adobe bricks, you know, the rammed wall. I think that there is really a lot of research that has gone on. I remember while at the Ahmadu Bello University, some 20-something, 25 years ago, you know, 30 years ago, the McGill University in Montreal actually had, there was a project that they were doing with the Ahmadu Bello University on rammed earth, and then there was this Professor Schwarzweger, right, you know, was actually in charge of that, where they did series of research on building the traditional home, and the McGill University was really into it, and there's a lot of publication on that. And somehow I believe that we're kind of like, repeat, some of these things end up in the shelf, right, you know, without them, you know, being practicalized. So I'm thinking, you know, if there's a way of actually bringing, you know, some of these work, you know, out, you know, as someone did mention, pilot projects, you know, and all that. I think there are actually a lot of pilot projects, but there are really no publications to really publicize some of this, you know, work, whether it's in Abuja, it's in Lagos, or in fact, throughout South Africa, for instance, you know, the traditional architecture, whether it's the Cape Dutch, right, you know, architecture, or the traditional Zulu architecture, there are many of them, but I think in terms of, you know, publication and inculcating that into the school curriculum is where there seems to be a lot of gap, because a lot of practitioners are really doing that we're not hearing about. So I will probably want to suggest that that's one area to, you know, to focus on, to bring this research, right, into the mainstream.
Yes, and that is part of the plan, doing all of the research and publishing it. Our CPDI interns, we're working with many amazing scholars starting now, pulling this information together and putting it out there. You know, one thing we always hear, how can you teach African architecture in the schools? There's no evidence of it. What books will we use? First of all, there are some books, but yes, but so much more has to be written so that professors will have texts to refer their students to. And then of course, the last thing, building some of these prototypes. We want to start getting some prototypes built. Hopefully next year, we're doing some crowdfunding. Let's start doing them one at a time, showing those examples and really publicizing them so people can see, come, touch, feel, experience, see what it costs. Again, you know, when we said the design brief was all about starting out with a house, that was so that we could perfect the language at that small scale. And then once we've done that, then we can scale up to, you know, malls, skyscrapers, museums, or whatever. But let's perfect the language first with that commodity that everybody has to have, and that's a house. You know, if everybody started with just designing and building their own personal home, you've got, you know, tons to reference. But yes, referencing and publications, that's where we are.
Nmadili, I'm just cognizant of time. We're about 10 minutes past 90 minutes right now. Did you want to take just one last question before we end the session?
Oh yeah, one last is fine. Yes.
So I realized, I noticed one hand that was raised by Emmanuel. Did you have a question for Nmadili? Oh, I think you're muted.
Hello.
Yes.
Yes.
Hi.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you, Nmadili, the cultural architect, for such a wonderful presentation. Well, my own contribution to it is that a whole appreciation of design of buildings needs to be understood. That is that the design of buildings itself is not well understood in many parts of Africa. Are you hearing me?
Yes.
Okay. So what I think is that first, we need to bring the appreciation of design of buildings to be well known to the public. And that we can do by professional associations, trying to make sure that government, opens up the vista of design when it comes to public projects. I'm sure that many people have ideas. All the people that contributed to your program, I'm sure that if they had opportunities to contribute to public projects, the same ideas they will want to put in. And then both the policy experts and the people will become aware that there's a need to be Afrocentric, in our approach. Many public projects go on in Africa, and they are not done by even local professionals or architects. In fact, nobody, for example, in Nigeria, many public projects go on without even the professionals on ground being aware that these projects are taking place. I think professional associations like the NIA, like ARCON, like the South African Institute of Architects, need to tell politicians that when there are public projects, there's a need to embrace all kinds of ideas. And you never know, many of these Afrocentric ideas may actually come into play in many of these projects. And if one or two gets implemented, then Afrocentrism might just become something that's taken more seriously. I understand the fact that you're starting from the unit, the house, that is most critical to people, but we should take it further. And then practitioners themselves need to demonstrate in their own projects these Afrocentric ideas. Our people, they're persuaded by what they see much more than what they read about. Even in curriculums, when we train students in traditional architecture, find out that they go out there and nobody is interested in whatever they want to say about traditional designs and sustainable designs. The value system of the public itself needs to be approached or changed through demonstration projects, one, like you suggested, two, public demonstration in public projects. Those are so important to this idea. Yes. That's my contribution. Well done for the great work you're doing. Yeah.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Thank you for your comments. Very on point. If our governments would welcome this type of a conversation, you will start seeing things change overnight. And yes, in those public buildings. So, whether it's, government projects, and again, hospitality and tourism. I can't get away from that because everyone's building nice resorts and hotels everywhere. And it's a perfect opportunity to showcase culture. I mean, tourism, that's where people spend money. So yes, those large scale projects, that's a great start. We began with the house only just, like I said, to perfect the language. That was in 2015. Our 2017 focused on monumental architecture, and our next competition for next year definitely will be focusing again on monumental architecture, because it's just a great opportunity to capture this ideology or these philosophies of design. So thank you very much, Emmanuel, for your comment.
Thank you very much, Nmadili. So I'll stop. I'll close the question and answer period now, and I'll ask you if you have any final comments or information that you want to give everyone before we leave.
Okay, just thrilled for the turnout today. I've been reading the chat. Everybody kind of enjoyed the presentation, lots of takeaways. So I really appreciate continued dialogue with everyone. Of course, University, Athabasca, Canada, let's do many great things together. I know we are planning for that. So yes, everyone kind of reach out, cpdiafrica.org. Check out what we've done thus far. We're working on our new platform. Our global studio for African-centered architecture will be launching in January. So people will be able to sign on and take courses. Hey, what do you want to learn about African architecture? Come on, we've got experts. Some of them are on this screen right now who will be teaching some of our classes. So come learn all about Igbo architecture, like I said, Ashanti, Kosa, just come and join us, and let's work together. So again, Professor Douglas MacLeod and his amazing team, thank you so very much. Sam, thank you.
Well, thank you, Nmadili, and thank you, Sam, for a wonderful talk. It's much appreciated, and we all look forward to working with you in the future.
Thank you. All right.
Thank you very much. This is an interesting one, and we hope to meet you soon again, so we will gain a lot from you.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
All right.
I don't know.
Thank you.
Email me at any time you want to come.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.